Hello, humanoids. It's Adam and Akbar here for episode 13 in our course on philosophy of climate change. Thus far, we have equipped ourselves with some tools for problem-oriented inquiry. We then gave ourselves some basic facts and knowledge about climate science, and now we're in this new module, starting to put it all together here, talking about climate politics. This is the first in a three-part series on theories of climate politics, where we look at it as essentially applied science. So let's get into it. Oh, new feature. Check this out. Akbar, loving it? Yeah. Akbar asks a rhetorical question. He thought this was funny because it's not really a rhetorical question. It's a question about rhetoric. I have the link for this article in the notes. You can check it out. I thought it was fascinating, especially living in Texas, where climate change is a particularly politicized topic. Maybe we shouldn't talk about climate change at all as a matter of smart rhetoric. Maybe it's better just talk about resilience, or as is actually the case in some of the bills passed in the Texas legislature, future proofing. So let's talk about future-proofing Houston and coastal areas from hurricanes. We don't have to talk about climate change at all, and we can accomplish some of the same adaptation goals or adaptation policies. So anyways, that's Akbar's rhetorical question for the day, new feature. Let's jump into the meat of the talk for today. So what I want to do is just describe and evaluate this theory of climate politics that I think is probably fairly intuitive and in some ways kind of simple and maybe overly simple. And I want to think through it because I believe that it happens a lot and it's in people's heads a lot, although maybe not very well examined. So let's put that out there and examine it. So what we're going to do is just describe it with an example quickly from something that I've assigned you to watch, and then we'll model it out very simply. Give you some brief history of it. You know, that's where I get philosophically too nerdy and Akbar has to rein me in. But I do want to set this in context. That's one of my jobs, is to give you some perspective and orientation. And history, in my opinion, is kind of the gateway to philosophy. And then we'll wrap up by evaluating this theory. I have some things to say in its defense, and I have some critical things to say about it. And by way of criticism, we're going to then look ahead at the next two theories of climate politics because they will take more into account, or at least arguably they're going to take more into account than this theory does. And so having all three of them and being a pluralist might be a good idea. Okay, so look, the point of this course is partly to give you some information about climate change so you have this sort of basic climate literacy in the sense of there's stuff you know. But I think the bigger point is to give you tools for thinking, right? So whatever articles you encounter or arguments you get into the future, you can say, this person has an applied science theory of climate politics, right? They're applying the linear model, what we're going to talk about today. So you can recognize that, and then you can say, these are the strengths and weaknesses of that. That's, I think, the point of this class, is to give you maps and tools and heuristics to help you think through whatever particular situation around climate change you encounter in the future. So today, let's think about what if, so we've done all this time about science, what if politics is really just an extension of science? That's where this theory gets its origins. It's just an applied science. You discover the problem. We've talked about that with greenhouse gas emissions and the Keeling curve of concentrations in the atmosphere going up. And then you just apply a solution, and that's what politics is. It's the application of science, right? So that's kind of the theory in a nutshell. Now, I had you watch Greta Thunberg's TED Talk for many reasons, and one of them just simply because she's burst onto the scene as this powerful voice in the climate discourse. But one is, I thought, in a way, she illustrates this theory. She says at one point in this talk, people says I should become a climate scientist to solve the climate crisis. And she says, actually, it's already been solved. We have all the facts and the solutions, and all we have to do is wake up in change, she says. Why should I study more science and facts when you're just ignoring the science and facts that we've already got? It means nothing to you, politicians and society. So she's got, I think, some sort of theory in her mind that, look, we did the science, we know it, we know the facts, now we just need to apply those into action. And there's a breakdown there, but that's the way it goes, is you do the science and then boom, the solution falls out, we've got it, we just need to have the willpower to enact it. So let's put this theory in Adam's dopey graphic, okay, with Akbar's help. He wants me to remind you, anything that's not dopey about this is Akbar. So you do the science. Science produces knowledge. Knowledge compels political consensus. Everybody agrees because we can all look at the same facts, right? From the consensus, you then get wise policy action. That's the theory. Now, in science policy literature, they call it the linear model because, look, it's just a line, straight line. Do the science, produce the knowledge, now you got the facts lead to consensus, everybody agrees because, look, the facts are the facts. And then from that, now we have a basis for enacting the changes that we need to make. Let the science speak, right? Okay, simple, right? Like I said, maybe too simple. History of this theory, okay. This is Plato. It has a long history and a tortured history that I'm going to make way too quick and simple here, but I think it's fascinating. What's really going on, think back to Hannah Arendt. I'm channeling Hannah Arendt. I mentioned her last time, greatest political thinker of the 20th century. So what she writes about Plato, she says, actually Plato in all of political philosophy since has been a series of escape plans from politics, because politics is all about action. And action is frail. The things we want to accomplish as organizations rarely ever come to fruition, right? It's futile. Action happens in the moment, the spoken word, the great deed, and then it's over, right? And it's unpredictable. With action, we have unbounded chains of events. We create this cascading consequences that we can't predict how it's going to unfold. That's the realm of politics and action. And she says Plato and all of political philosophers almost have wanted to control that and contain it and replace action with making. Because in making, you perceive something, so you have this beginner, this soul, the ruler, the knower, and then you execute it. In his dichotomy, that's the body or the ruled or the doer. So here's this idea of you do the science and then you apply it, right? There's the knowledge and then there's the making, and we can control it. It's like a blueprint, in other words. The philosopher king coming out of Socrates in Plato's dialogues, or a monarch, monism, one ruler, would have and create this blueprint and everybody else would just put it in place or apply it or build it or make it, right? So this is the beginnings of this theory. Socrates also talks about knowledge as virtue. Once you know the right thing to do, you'll do the right thing, right? Greta Thunberg, in her talk, she says, we all think we know, and we all think everybody knows, but we don't. Because if we really knew, we would act, right? That's what the linear model says. Knowledge leads to consensus, leads to action. So we don't really know. What's going on? Well, I think both Socrates and Thunberg agree. We basically forget. In this case, the climate crisis is so big and so nebulous and so massive that in a way, it falls out of our brain. It's just not something we can even contain in there. So there's this forgetfulness going on. And then Aristotle talked about this too. He also said, how is it that we can know the right thing to do? And this is not just Thunberg, but I think a lot of climate activists, a lot of climate scientists think, look, we know the right thing to do. Think back to Jim Hansen, the article about the renowned climate scientist going out and protesting and getting arrested. We know the right thing to do. Why aren't we doing it, right? Well, the answer from Aristotle up through Thunberg and Jim Hansen, we lack the willpower. We have this weakness of will. So this theory has a long history. It also has a modern history. So beginning in, let's say, 16th, 17th, 18th century, I put this book in your notes so you can go and reference it. It's a great one, a classic. Um, it's about Hobbes and Boyle. And the argument of this book is basically Boyle won the debate with Hobbes because Boyle said, look, science can, let me put it here, science can act as a neutral authority that can transcend politics and secure the assent of society, especially a pluralist society with different religious worldviews. That's what they needed in the early modern era when you had different religious factions beating each other over the head to try to establish who was the authoritative voice of truth and knowledge. Science rose above all of that and said, regardless of your religious worldview, this scientific view gives us and discloses reality, which then becomes the basis for the evidence on which we make decisions as a democratic, growing democratic societies. We'll come back to Hobbes in this lecture and later ones because Hobbes disagreed about that. But Boyle won, right? That's the societies we built, science-based societies. So in the 19th century, this ideal of, hey, just get the science right and the right decision will fall out the other end, this kind of linear model, it took the form of these ideas of technocracy or scientific management. In forestry, for example, we'll study the forests and there'll be one best way will emerge, the consensus way of managing forests. Well, we should plant these species because they have the greatest value, and that's all calculated out. It's all very scientific, right? Technocracy is the philosopher king, right? From Socrates. It's the same story. Those who know should rule, right? Science will lead to action. It's the same sort of linear idea. This is in your notes as well. This is the document, Science, the Endless Frontier, by a guy named Vannevar Bush that gave birth to the National Science Foundation. And it is like the modern locus classicus, the origins in recent history of the linear model. And the basic idea behind this document is, look, science won the war. Science will win the peace. We just give money to science and it'll come up to solutions to all our problems. It's a theory of politics as applied science, climate politics now for our class as applied science. Okay, now, that's it in a nutshell in its history. In its defense, I think there's a lot going for it, right? First of all, leaders do have a responsibility to make decisions on empirical evidence. I'm sitting here recording this during a pandemic, and I sure hope that our leaders are looking at the best data they can find from the best scientists to help inform their decisions. So yes, policymakers have an obligation to listen to and follow the science, and that's built into this linear model. So it has that much going for it that makes sense. And yeah, I do think science is the arbiter of truth, at least when it comes to evidentiary truth about what's going on in the world. In pluralist secular societies, we can't elevate any given religious faction to this position. Science, more or less, is neutral with respect to all of those. Maybe, at least, right? And also, this linear model clearly makes sense, at least for tame problems. Remember our distinction between tame and wicked. Tame problems where there's kind of an end in view that everybody can agree on, and then there's a kind of broken pipe that we need to fix to get to that end. This model makes a lot of sense for that. I put this in here, a nod to Spock, another great science fiction hero of mine. A little more logic would be a good thing when you survey our political debates about climate change. This model, insofar as it's saying, look, can we just listen to the science? I'll agree, that's a good thing. And also, this model, it foregrounds the importance of shielding scientific independence and autonomy. Look, do you really want the FDA to conclude on food and drug safety based on whatever administration is in power wants to hear about food and drug safety, or do you want them to follow the evidence, right? You need them to have the autonomy to speak truth to power, even if it's an inconvenient truth. And so all of these things, more or less, I think the linear model has going for it, and these are good things. But there's problems with it too. First of all, it just doesn't often work, especially with wicked problems like climate change. The more and more science, the more and more carbon emissions. It's like there's this disconnect. Why is it that there's often, not just with climate change, think about genetically modified organisms or storing nuclear waste or managing public lands, all of these environmental issues and more. It seems like we keep doing more and more science, but it doesn't lead to that political consensus and then the shared notion of what a wise policy action would be. So the model seems to break down descriptively in reality a lot. Now, you could say it's still a good ideal model. We just don't have, say, the political will or something to enact it. But it's not a great model if it doesn't describe actually what's going on. What I think is the biggest point to put out here is that, remember Hannah Arendt's point about plurality? We are not clones, right? We're not cogs in a machine. And so there's different ways of accessing and interpreting and understanding reality, and that's just the human condition. When it comes to science, there's uncertainty and disagreement, even among the experts. On politics, there's disagreement about the ends and the best means to the ends, even if you agree on the ends. So no, Plato was wrong. Politics is not making, and you can't turn politics and action into making. At least you can't do so without totally disenfranchising people and making them effectively just obedient servants to whatever some monarch or philosopher king would set in place. The other thing that's problematic with the linear model is it tends to promote not the politicization of science, but its opposite, the scientization of politics. In other words, people arguing what are essentially values positions through the guise of science, and each one saying, if you just listen to the facts, we would come to the right conclusion. That's not a helpful argument, and it happens a lot in climate politics. Everybody's arguing their values through what looks like a fact-based disagreement, but it's not. So it's not always the case that more science, which the linear model makes it look like, if we just did more science, we get more consensus, we get better decisions. Not always the case that more science helps. Sometimes more science actually obfuscates or worsens the problems, deepens the disagreements. So the model has a lot of weaknesses too. Plus, as Spock said, logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. So insofar as this model is all about let's be logical, let's be fact-based, good, yeah, but that's not totally enough. That's not all that's going on. So last slide here. This is looking ahead. Here's the model again. But consider, doesn't science always lead to knowledge? Well, not always. Sometimes it leads to uncertainty. Sometimes the experts are disagreeing with themselves. Next time we'll talk about an excess of objectivity, or what Hobbes called seeing double. Even when you get scientists going to a lab and they're going to determine what reality is, what if they come out the other side of the lab and they disagree with each other? Now we're still seeing double. It's just like the Protestants and the Catholics still yelling at each other, right? So that's a problem. We talk about media a lot. Getting from this knowledge to a political consensus, it gets mediated through these different framing devices, and you find people developing incommensurable epistemologies, meaning there's no way of adjudicating between your reality and the facts that you've got to base it in mine, right? We see that in climate politics happening, which then leads to these persistent factions who have alternative stories, some of which we're looking at in this module. The climate is an existential crisis? No, the climate is a manageable problem. And then, of course, there's stories about it's all a hoax, conspiratorial. But it's not just ignorance or lies. Right? That's what the linear model would have you think, is that the only thing that could break down here is people don't know something, or they're lying about it. It's much more complicated than that. And then finally, let's say we do arrive at a political consensus about the science and there's a problem. What are we going to do about it? It's like the wise policy action isn't self-evident, For example, nuclear power, there's a huge disagreement among people who think climate change is real, even those who think it's very real, very serious existential threat. Should we do more nuclear power? Well, there's a huge disagreement about that. It's not as simple as just applying the science as if, again, this solution will just be self-evident at the end of some sort of algorithmic process, right? Not to mention the competing priorities that are at stake, and then the uncertainties about if we do this, what will be the costs and benefits. We can't see into the future very well. When we act, again, action unleashes consequences in a chain that are unpredictable. So we have to take more into account, and that's what we're going to do in the next couple of lectures. But for now, Akbar got a little bit frustrated with this talk because it's all politics, and politics is messy, but he says, I run a clean ship, at least. So that's your word from the good Admiral Akbar. And until next time, as always, may the force be